The wind was a blade out here on the plains, sharp and unforgiving, even in the late autumn. Thomas Beckett felt it scour his bones as he stood on the rise, surveying the meager spread he called a ranch. A few head of cattle, gaunt and weary, huddled near the inadequate shelter of the barn. The cabin, small and weather-beaten, looked like a forgotten stone discarded by a careless hand. Everything about this place felt stark, a reflection of the life he had built around himself since the world cracked open. 4 years had passed since Sarah and little David were taken by the fever. 4 years of silence that pressed in on him from all sides, filling the cabin, drowning out the wind's lament. He had buried them on the small knoll overlooking the creek, beneath a pair of gnarled cottonwood trees that seemed to mourn alongside him, their branches' skeletal fingers clawing at the indifferent sky. Grief was a physical weight, a stone in his gut that never lightened. It had reshaped him, hardening his features, deepening the lines around his eyes, stripping away the easy smile he once possessed. He was 38, but he felt older, worn down like a river stone by the relentless current of solitude and sorrow. He kept to himself. The nearest town, Fort Bridger, was a 2-day ride, and he rarely made the journey. The few times he had ventured there, the pity in people's eyes, or worse, the nervous shuffling away, had driven him back to his self-imposed exile. He was Sam Beckett, the man who had lost everything, a walking ghost haunting his own life. He spoke little, his voice a low rumble when he did. His days were a monotonous cycle of chores, mending fences, tending the cattle, chopping wood, designed to fill the time, to tire him out enough that sleep might offer a temporary reprieve from the memories that clawed at him in the dark. He had thought the loneliness would lessen, that time would smooth the jagged edges of his loss. It hadn't. The silence was a constant companion, and the landscape, vast and indifferent under the enormous sky, mirrored the emptiness inside him. He was an island in a sea of grass and rock, adrift and alone. Winter arrived with brutal efficiency that year. Early snow fell, thick and heavy, burying the land under a white shroud. The wind intensified, whipping the snow into blinding blizzards that erased the horizon and howled around the cabin like a pack of starving wolves. It was during the worst of one such storm, the air thick with swirling white, visibility barely a few yards, that he found them. He had been checking on the cattle huddled in the barn, ensuring they had enough feed and weren't exposed to the worst of the wind. The snow was already thigh-deep in places, clinging to his beard and lashes. The air burned his lungs with every breath. He was heading back towards the cabin, head down against the gale, when he stumbled upon them near the frozen creek bed. They were a heap of rags and snow, partially buried in a drift. At first he thought it was debris the wind had piled up. Then he saw a small, still hand protruding from the snow. A jolt, sharp and unwelcome, went through him. Hesitantly, he knelt, brushing away the snow. It was a woman, wrapped in thin, inadequate blankets, and beside her, huddled together, were 3 children, small forms shivering uncontrollably, faces pale and etched with cold. They were Navajo, he saw immediately, their dark hair, their clothing, what little was visible beneath the snow. He knew enough about the tensions out here, the fear and resentment many white settlers held towards the tribes, particularly after recent conflicts. His first gut reaction was caution, the instinct to retreat, but the sight of the children, their lips tinged blue, their eyes wide and frightened, froze him. A phantom ache stirred in his chest, a ghostly echo of the protectiveness he had felt for his own son. The woman stirred, a low groan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pools in a face slick with snow and what looked like grime. Fear flashed in them as she saw him, a tall, bearded white man looming over her. She tried to pull the children closer, a weak, futile gesture. He didn't speak, didn't know what words he would use even if he tried. Instead, he reached down and gently felt the woman's arm. It was stiff with cold. One leg looked awkwardly bent beneath her. Broken? He couldn't tell under the layers. He looked at the children again, a boy, maybe 5 or 6, thin and large-eyed. 2 girls, younger, pressed against their mother's side like frozen birds. They weren't going to last long out here. Not in this storm. He knew that with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind. He could leave them. No one would know. It was the sensible thing, many would say. Bringing Native Americans, strangers, into his home was a risk. But the image of David, bundled against the cold, laughing at a snowflake on his nose, flashed behind his eyes. He couldn't. He just couldn't. He made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He scooped up the youngest child, a girl, her body frighteningly light. She whimpered, a tiny, pathetic sound. He held her close, trying to transfer some of his own body heat. "Cabin," he said, his voice rough from disuse, gesturing towards the distant, barely visible shape of his home. He looked at the woman. Warmth, safety. He wasn't sure she understood, but the desperation in her eyes, the way she looked from him to the cabin, suggested she grasped the basic offer. Betting them to the cabin was an ordeal. He carried the youngest girl, then came back for one of the others, struggling through the deepening snow. He helped the older boy, pushing him, urging him forward. The woman tried to walk but collapsed almost immediately. He had to help her, half carrying, half dragging her, her weight a dead pull against his strength. It took an age, the wind tearing at them, the snow relentless. By the time they reached the cabin door, he was exhausted, his muscles screaming, his face numb. He kicked the door open and guided them inside. The air in the cabin was warm, thick with the smell of pine smoke from the fire he kept burning constantly. It felt like stepping into a different world. He got the children inside first, moving them towards the fireplace. He helped the woman hobble in, easing her down onto the floor near the hearth. She collapsed, gasping, shivering violently. The children huddled around the fire, their small forms trembling. Their eyes followed him, wary and unsure. He moved quickly, shedding his coat, his hat, his gloves. He piled more wood onto the fire. He found blankets, rough but warm, and wrapped them around the children, then around the woman. He had some leftover stew from the day before, thick with beans and elk meat. He warmed it and ladled it into bowls, offering it to them. They ate slowly, cautiously at first, then with a desperate hunger that was painful to watch. The woman ate little, her focus on her children. She watched him constantly, her dark eyes missing nothing. He didn't push conversation. He didn't know her name, or her children's names, or how they had come to be collapsed in the snow near his property. Those questions could wait. Survival came first. The woman's leg was definitely broken. He saw once she was warmer and had shed some outer layers, twisted at an unnatural angle just below the knee. He had basic medical knowledge, learned from years of living out here. He cleaned the wound as best he could, gently straightened the bone, and splinted it using some thin pieces of wood from his kindling pile, padding it with strips of cloth. She gritted her teeth through the pain, not making a sound, clutching her children's hands. Her stoicism impressed him, a quiet strength that resonated with his own. That first night was long. The storm raged outside. Inside, the children slept fitfully by the fire. The woman remained awake, watching him whenever he moved, her presence a tangible weight in the small space. He slept on his cot across the room, his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. It wasn't that he expected trouble, not exactly. It was habit, the ingrained wariness of a man who lived alone on the edge of the wilderness, and the knowledge that he had just brought strangers, native strangers, into his life. He wondered what people in Fort Bridger would say if they knew. He didn't dwell on it. The next day the storm eased, but the snow remained deep. They were effectively trapped. Life in the cabin settled into a strange, silent rhythm. He went about his chores, tending the fire, melting snow for water, checking the cattle. The woman, whose name he learned was Nahili, remained near the fire, her leg propped up. Her children, the boy named Sali, and the girls, Ayana and Onawa, were timid at first, clinging to their mother. But children were resilient. Soon they were exploring the small cabin, their initial fear giving way to curiosity. Their presence was a shock to the system. The silence that had been his constant companion was broken by quiet whispers, small thuds, the rustle of blankets, and occasionally the soft, almost forgotten sound of children's laughter. It was a sound that ripped at his gut, a reminder of what he had lost, but also something else. A warmth, a faint echo of life that had been missing for so long. Communication was difficult. Nahili spoke some English, broken but understandable. He knew a few words of Navajo, mostly learned from brief, tense encounters over the years, but enough to get by on simple things. Most of their communication was through gestures, expressions, and shared tasks. She would point to the dwindling woodpile, and he would nod and go out to chop more. He would gesture towards the water pail, and Solly, overcoming his shyness, would fetch more snow to melt. Slowly, tentatively, they began to trust each other. He saw the fierce, quiet love Nahili had for her children, the way she rationed the food to ensure they had enough, the pain in her eyes when she looked at her broken leg, knowing she was a burden. He saw the children's resilience, their quick smiles once they felt safe, their fascination with the simple things in his cabin, a carved bird he had made years ago, an old harmonica. She saw his quiet competence, the way he moved around the cabin, the gentle way he handled the injured calf in the barn. She saw the sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, particularly when he looked towards the small knoll where his family was buried. She saw the care he took with her leg, the way he ensured they were warm and fed before he tended to himself. One evening, as he sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, Nahili spoke, her voice low. "You, lost?" she asked, gesturing towards the knoll visible through the window, softened now by the snow. He hesitated, then nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "My wife, Sarah, my son, David." She nodded slowly, her expression one of deep understanding, not pity. "Mine too, husband, 2 daughters, sickness, long walk. Bad snow." Her English faltered, the words inadequate for the weight of her loss. He looked at her then, really looked at her. He had seen her as a stranger, a native woman, a problem brought to his doorstep by the storm. Now, he saw a woman who carried a grief as heavy as his own, a survivor fighting to protect the family she had left. The shared understanding of loss, unspoken for so long, created a fragile bridge between them. The snow eventually melted enough for travel, but Nahili's leg was far from healed. She couldn't walk on it, let alone travel. He knew he couldn't turn them out. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The thought surprised him. He had planned to help them get to the nearest reservation or settlement when the weather broke, but the cabin no longer felt empty. The silence was gone, replaced by the quiet presence of a family. He made the decision to let them stay until Nahili could travel. He told her so, his voice gruff. She simply nodded, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it changed her face, chasing away some of the weariness and fear. Their life together continued, evolving. Solly helped him with chores that didn't require strength or height, eager to be useful. Ayanna and Onawa played outside when the weather allowed, their bright jackets splashes of color against the white landscape. Nahili, confined to the cabin, used her time mending their threadbare clothes, weaving small, intricate patterns from scraps of yarn he provided, or teaching her children quiet games and stories in their language. He began to talk more, hesitantly at first, telling them about the land, about the cattle, about the changing seasons. He even found himself telling them about Sarah and David, showing them a worn photograph he kept hidden away. Nahili listened with quiet attention, her eyes compassionate. The children, sensing the shift in him, grew bolder, asking him questions, sharing their own simple observations. He learned about their journey, how they had been traveling to find relatives after being displaced, how they had been caught unprepared by the early storm. He learned about their life before, their customs, their stories. He found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the quiet hours by the fire, the children settled nearby, talking with Nahili. The initial wariness had faded, replaced by a comfortable familiarity, a mutual respect. He started to see her not as a Navajo woman or a stranger, but simply as Nahili, a strong, kind woman who was helping to fill the aching void in his life. He knew the outside world would not approve. Talk had likely already reached Fort Bridger that he was harboring Native Americans. Prejudice ran deep here. There were stories of retaliatory raids, of settlers being attacked, but he couldn't bring himself to care. This small, unexpected family had brought life back into his dead world. The external threat he had anticipated materialized weeks later. It was a crisp, clear day. The snow was thawing, revealing muddy patches of ground. Thomas was outside with Solly, teaching the boy how to mend a section of fence when they saw the riders approaching. 5 men, hard-faced and armed, led by Frank Brody, a particularly unpleasant man from Fort Bridger known for his loud opinions and dislike of anyone not like him. Thomas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He sent Solly running back to the cabin, instructing him to tell Nahili to keep the children inside and stay out of sight. He walked towards the fence line, his rifle in his hand, held loosely but ready. Brody and his men reined in their horses a few yards away, dust and mud flying up. Their eyes, cold and hard, swept over the ranch, lingering on the cabin. "Beckett," Brody said, his voice loud and aggressive. "Heard you got some visitors." Parrish Thomas didn't lower his rifle. "My business, Brody." "When your business involves sheltering redskins, it becomes our business," another man snarled. "There are women and children in there," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. "They were caught in the storm, injured. I gave them shelter." Brody laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Injured? Or scouts? Spies? You know what they do, Beckett. They scalp, they burn." "They're starving and hurt," Thomas repeated, his grip tightening on the rifle. "They mean no harm." "We ain't taking chances," Brody said, his eyes narrowing. "Send 'em out. We'll escort 'em off the territory." For their own good and ours. The implication was clear. Escort 'em likely meant something far worse than just sending them away. Thomas looked back at the cabin. He thought of Nahili, of Ayanna and Onawa, of Solly, who had just been learning to tie a fence wire. He thought of the quiet moments by the fire, the shared grief, the tentative dawning of something akin to peace he hadn't felt in years. He thought of David. He had failed to protect his first family from sickness. He would not fail to protect this unexpected, fragile new connection from the cruelty of men. "They aren't going anywhere," Thomas said, his voice low, but carrying an iron resolve that surprised even himself. Brody's smile vanished. "You challenging us, Beckett, for a few Injuns?" "I'm telling you to turn around and ride out," Thomas said, raising his rifle slightly, the barrel pointing towards Brody's chest. "This is my land. This is my home. The people inside are under my protection. You want them, you'll have to go through me." The air crackled with tension. The other men shifted uneasily. They hadn't expected this from the quiet, withdrawn rancher. They had expected him to meekly hand over his charges to avoid trouble. Brody hesitated, his gaze flickering from Thomas's face to the rifle barrel. He saw the grim determination in Thomas's eyes, the set of his jaw. This wasn't the grieving widower they knew. This was a man who had found something to fight for again. Brody had numbers, but Thomas had the high ground, the element of surprise in his defiance, and the home field advantage. A shootout here, in the open, with Thomas possibly a decent shot, could be messy. And for what? Just to satisfy their hatred and fear. "You're making a mistake, Beckett," Brody spat, his face red with frustration. "You're on your own now. Don't expect any help from town." "Paraffin did," Thomas replied, his voice flat. Brody stared at him for another long moment, then swung his horse around. "Let's go," he barked at his men. "He ain't worth the trouble, not yet." They rode off, leaving Thomas standing alone by the fence line, rifle still raised, the silence after their departure feeling deafening. His hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. From adrenaline and something else. A surge of fierce, protective anger that felt strangely invigorating after years of passive sorrow. He watched until they were out of sight, then lowered his rifle. He turned and walked back towards the cabin. As he approached, the door opened cautiously, and Nahili stood there, her expression anxious. Behind her, he could see the children peeking out, their faces pale. He met Nahili's eyes. He didn't say anything, just nodded. He had made his choice. He had defended them. He had chosen connection over isolation, acceptance over prejudice, even at the risk of alienating himself completely from the white community. She understood. He saw it in the softening of her gaze, the subtle lifting of the tension in her shoulders. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. As he passed her, she reached out and lightly touched his arm. It was a small gesture, but in the context of their guarded interactions, it felt monumental. A silent acknowledgement, a thank you, a recognition of the bond that had formed between them. Life didn't suddenly become easy. Brody and his men didn't return, but the unspoken threat lingered. Thomas knew they were truly on their own now. But the fear was tempered by a growing sense of purpose, a feeling of belonging he hadn't expected to find again. Taksha Nahili's leg healed slowly, but it healed true. By late spring she was walking with a limp, but able to move around freely. The cabin felt crowded now, but in a good way. It was filled with the rhythm of a family. Solly helped Thomas with the spring planting, his small hands surprisingly adept. Ayanna and Onawa followed Nahili everywhere, learning about the herbs she found in the fields, helping with the cooking and cleaning. Thomas found himself laughing sometimes, a sound that felt alien at first, then increasingly natural. He watched the children play, their energy a vibrant contrast to his years of stillness. He watched Nahili, her quiet strength, her practical wisdom. He saw the way she looked at him sometimes, a warmth in her eyes that made something tight in his chest loosen. One evening, sitting by the fire, the children asleep, the air soft with the coming of summer, Thomas spoke, the words feeling both heavy and right. "Nahili," he began, "your leg is strong now, you could travel, find your people." She looked at him, her expression calm. "This is good place, children are safe, you, good man. You don't have to stay because you feel obligated," he said, fumbling for the right words. "Because I helped you." She smiled faintly. "I stay because I want to stay. Children want to stay." She paused, then her gaze met his directly. "You, lonely. We, lonely. Maybe, not lonely together." His breath caught in his throat. Not lonely together. The simple phrase held a profound truth. He had been so consumed by his grief, so convinced that his life was over, that he had never imagined this. The possibility of not being alone, the possibility of finding connection, even love again, in this most unexpected way, with this woman so different from his lost Sarah, from his lost life, a woman who understood loss in a way no one else he knew ever could. "Not lonely together," he repeated, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue, but resonating deep within him. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. Her skin was warm, strong. She didn't pull away. The prejudice from Fort Bridger didn't entirely disappear. Some settlers avoided him. Brody still glared whenever their paths crossed in town, which was rare. But out here, on his land, under the vast indifferent sky, they built their own world. Thomas Beckett, the grieving widower, and Nahili, the Navajo widow, and her 3 children. A family forged not by blood or societal expectation, but by shared hardship, unexpected kindness, and the quiet, resilient power of human connection. Promise's Ranch, once a monument to his isolation and grief, became a place of life. The cabin, no longer silent, echoed with the sounds of children's play, Nahili's soft singing in her native tongue, and Thomas's own voice, growing stronger, less haunted. He found a new rhythm to his days, one that included teaching Solly how to ride, watching Ayanna and Onawa chase butterflies in the meadow, and sharing quiet meals with Nahili. The silence between them now comfortable, filled with understanding rather than emptiness. The seasons turned. The deep snow of winter gave way to the green explosion of spring, the dry heat of summer, and the golden melancholy of autumn. Each season brought its own challenges: cattle rustlers, unpredictable weather, the constant effort required to coax a living from the harsh land, but they faced them together. Thomas relied on Nahili's knowledge of the plants and animals, her quiet resilience in the face of adversity. She relied on his strength, his pragmatism, his fierce protectiveness. The children thrived. Solly grew taller, stronger, his initial shyness replaced by a quiet confidence. He worked alongside Thomas, learning the ways of the ranch, his laughter sometimes ringing out across the fields, a sound that still occasionally caught Thomas by surprise, a joyful counterpoint to the sorrow he had carried for so long. Ayanna and Onawa were inseparable, their presence a constant, lively current in the cabin. They learned English quickly, their voices bright and inquisitive, asking Thomas questions about everything, drawing him further out of his shell. Tasha Nahili's limp remained, a physical reminder of the day Thomas found them, but it didn't diminish her strength. She managed the household, gardened, and her quiet presence was the anchor of their makeshift family. She taught the children their heritage, telling them stories of their people, ensuring they did not forget where they came from. Thomas listened sometimes, sitting quietly, learning about a world different from his own, a world steeped in reverence for the land and the cycles of nature. Their love was not a sudden, explosive passion, but something that grew slowly, like a deep-rooted tree. It was in the shared glances across the fire, the comfortable silence side by side on the porch at dusk, the unspoken understanding of each other's past wounds. It was in the way Thomas made sure Nahili had what she needed for her leg, the way she made sure he ate properly, the quiet affection they showed the children together. It was a bond built on respect, shared loss, and the profound gratitude of two lonely souls who had found unexpected solace in each other's company. Occasionally, riders from Fort Bridger would pass by the ranch. Some would avoid eye contact, others would stare openly, disapproval etched on their faces. The prejudice hadn't gone away. It was a constant, low hum of judgment on the edges of their lives. But within the boundaries of their land, the old fences they mended together, the new garden Nahili planted, the walls of the cabin that now held so much life, they were safe, they were a family. One afternoon, years after that terrible storm, Thomas stood again on the rise, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was the same view he had looked upon in despair for so long. But now it looked different. The cabin below glowed with warm light. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. He could hear the faint sound of children's voices carrying on the breeze. Tresha Nahili came up beside him, her step still favoring her injured leg slightly. She didn't speak, just stood beside him, looking out at the land they shared. He reached for her hand, and this time there was no hesitation, no caution. It was a natural gesture, the touch of a husband for his wife. The past was still there, a part of them both, the losses they had endured etched into their souls, but it no longer defined them. It had brought them together, two broken pieces finding a way to fit, to create something new and whole. Home, he said, the word tasting foreign and wonderful on his tongue. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a place where laughter lived alongside sorrow, where different worlds met and found common ground, where a man who thought he had lost everything learned that love, like the resilient prairie grass, could always find a way to grow even in the harshest soil, even after the deepest winter. He looked at Nahili, her profile silhouetted against the fading light. She turned and looked at him, her dark eyes soft and full of a quiet strength that had seen her through unimaginable hardship and led her here, to him. She smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "Our home," she agreed softly. And in that moment, standing together on the land that had witnessed his deepest despair, surrounded by the family he had never expected, Thomas Beckett knew a peace that had eluded him for years. The silence of the plains was no longer empty, it was simply quiet, filled with the promise of a future built on resilience, understanding, and the enduring power of a love that arrived, like the first thaw after winter, unexpected and full of life.